Are you ready for the Word? Yes. Turn to Galatians 4. Look in verse 21. Tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise. Which things are an allegory? For these are the two covenants. The one from the Mount Sinai, which genders to bondage, which is Agar or Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answers to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem which is above is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written, Rejoice, you barren that bearest not, break forth and cry. You that travailest not, for the desolate has many more children than she which has a husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what says the Scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. Through our study of the book of Galatians, we have several times found it necessary to pause and remind ourselves of the warning that Peter gave when it came to reading the writings of Paul. I find it necessary to do that again this morning. Peter said that the writings of Paul are hard to be understood. Literally, it means hard to wrap your mind around. There are some things he says that it's hard to wrap your mind around them. It's a challenge to your brain. Also, he said, the unlearned and the unstable twist Paul's writings. Unlearned means to be ignorant. And that means, in this context, to be ignorant of Torah. To be unstable means to be unfixed. And to be unfixed means to be unfixed on Torah. And we've said it this way, and others have said it this way numerous times, that no one should read what Paul wrote until they read what Paul read. Because what Paul wrote is based on what he read, and what he read was Torah. Peter said that there are those who are unlearned and unstable, and they twist Paul's writings. The word he used was wrest, W-R-E-S-T, and that word literally means to make something the opposite of, to twist it and distort it so that it becomes the opposite of what it was meant to be. To reverse his words by wrenching them. So the unstable and the unlearned reverse Paul's words. Peter warned that those who do this bring destruction on themselves, and he said they are led away with the error of the wicked. Look that word up. It means to be led away with the error of lawlessness. So if you take and you read Paul's writings and you find something hard to understand, and your interpretation of that comes to be that you don't think we have to keep the law anymore, Peter says you're unlearned, you're unstable, and you twisted his words, and you're following the error of lawlessness. If you read something he wrote and it's hard to understand, it's okay to admit, well, that's hard to understand. It's a lot better to read it and say, that's hard to understand, than it is to read what he wrote and to conclude he was promoting the error of lawlessness. Peter warned us not to come to that conclusion. So, let me begin this morning by saying Paul's allegorical reference to Isaac and Ishmael, parts of it are hard to understand. I think it best to start this study then by talking about what we do understand. If we'll start with what we do understand, we won't misunderstand the rest of what he said. So let's start with this premise. Nowhere in all of the Bible is keeping the law called bondage. Nowhere. So if you've been taught that Paul wrote to try and free people from the bondage of the law, you have been mistaught. There's nowhere in the Bible that we're told that the law or the keeping of the law is bondage. Paul never refers to the law as bondage in any way. He wants those who read his epistles to be free from bondage, but the bondage he speaks of is not Torah. In Romans chapter 4, Romans 5, Romans 6, he speaks of how death reigned from Adam unto the Messiah. He speaks of how that we were slaves from Adam until our rebirth. But the slavery was not to the law. What were we slaves to? Anybody know? Sin. That's correct. We were slaves to sin. And so in Romans 7, Paul cries out and asks, who shall deliver me from this body of death? And then he rejoices that the deliverance comes from Yahweh through Yeshua. It is sin that men are in bondage to, and he states that over and over again. Men are slaves to sin. Now when you get to Galatians, Paul speaks of being in bondage to the elements of the world also. Galatians 4:3, even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. Well, we know that's not Torah. Torah is not an element of the world. Torah is the inspired words from Yahweh. Torah is spirit. Torah is holy. Torah is just. Torah is good. It's not an element of the world. Galatians 4:8, howbeit then when you knew not Yahweh, ye did service unto them which by nature are no Elohims. But now after that ye have known Yahweh, or rather are known of Yahweh, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage? So here we see the Gentiles turning back. Would the Gentiles be turning back to Torah? No. They didn't know Torah. He's talking about them returning back to the bondage of their religions that observed days, months, times, and years, and he called these weak and beggarly elements. There's that word again. Well, that's bondage. When you are turning back to the observance of these things, it's bondage. The rituals attached to false religion is bondage. If you've ever tried to break free of them, if you've ever succeeded in breaking free of them, you understand how enslaving they can be in the tentacles that they have trying to pull you back in. So when Paul talks about bondage, he talks about bondage to sin, and he talks about bondage to the elements of the world, and he talks about bondage to the elements that are associated with the rituals of false religion. So now let's go look at our text with that in mind, knowing what Paul calls bondage. Let's see what he says there again in verse 24. Which things are an allegory? For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which genders to bondage, which is Hagar. At first glance, this verse seems to be saying that the law, which was given at Mount Sinai, puts people in bondage. That's the way it's taught. But if that were true, if that's what verse 24 is saying, it would be the only place in the entire Bible that says that the law or keeping the law was bondage. Here is how we have to look at that verse. Peter warned us by the Ruach HaKodesh not to twist Paul's words. And the bondage Paul referred to was the bondage of sin or the bondage to false religion. Now with those two things in mind, consider Paul's allegory of Sarah and Hagar. Those two things in mind, let's think about the allegory he presented to us in chapter 4. Who was Hagar? Bondwoman of Abraham. She was Sarah's handmaiden. Okay? So she is in bondage to Sarah. She was given to Abraham. She gave birth to a son. The son's name was Ishmael. Ishmael was not born an heir of Abraham. Ishmael was born a slave to a slave woman. Understand that. The fact that Abraham was his father did not change his status. I'm going to say that again. The fact that Abraham was his father didn't change his status. He was born a slave to a slave woman. He was a byproduct of human effort by Abraham to produce an heir, but that human effort did not succeed. Through human effort, Abraham and Sarah came up with a plan to produce an heir. Yahweh refused their human effort.
That's correct.
It did not succeed, okay? The true heir would be produced by a promise that had to be believed.
Right. That's correct.
Hagar then represents a person who is in bondage already. Through human effort, there's an attempt to produce an heir. The effort does not succeed. She was a slave who could only produce a slave. Abraham was Ishmael's biological dad. But Ishmael was born a slave to a slave. The true heir promised by Yahweh to Abraham would have to come by faith. Therefore, when we read Galatians 4:24 and 25, we can clearly see that it is not the law that puts people in bondage. Let me show you. Listen carefully here. Hagar did not put Ishmael in bondage. We're following his allegory. Hagar did not put Ishmael in bondage. The point is, Hagar could do nothing to get him out of bondage. She tried through human effort to produce a son who would not be a slave. Her efforts failed.
That's correct.
Keep that in mind and read verse 24 and 25 again. Which things are an allegory? For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which genders to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answers to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. So let's break it down. The law or the covenant of Mount Sinai genders to bondage just like Hagar did. The word genders means to beget. More often, it's only translated gendereth one time. Every other time it's translated as to beget or to begat. All right? So it means to give birth to. So follow the analogy or the allegory he's given you. Hagar did not put Ishmael in bondage. She just couldn't do anything to get him out of it. The law did not put anybody in bondage. The law did not have the power to deliver them out of the bondage they were already in, but it didn't put them in that bondage. Okay? The bondage that men are in is sin. The law tells you what sin is, but it cannot deliver you from the bondage of it. So verse 24 is telling us the truth. Those who received the law did not begin to beget children who were no longer in bondage to sin. Again, I want to repeat that. Those who received the law at Mount Sinai did not, by receiving that law, then begin to beget children who were free of bondage. They had the law, and the law showed them what sin was, but the law did not have the power to deliver them from the bondage of that sin. Now look at verse 25 closely. This Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and answers to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. The word translated answereth there. You remember in verse 3 and verse 9 we looked at the word element? Does anybody remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about that word, what that word actually refers to, or what kind of term it is? It's a military term. That word translated elements is a military term, and it refers to an army being in perfect form, perfect line, and when they move in perfect unison. step by step by step. So the elements of the world are the orderly things of the world, or the elements of a false religion are the orderly rituals of that religion. Okay? Well, this word translated answereth comes from the same Greek root word. And so what it's saying is that Hagar marches in step with Jerusalem. Answereth to Jerusalem means that. Marches in step with Jerusalem that now is, or the Jerusalem that now is marches in step with her. They are both acting the same exact way. The point's really not complicated at all. It's quite simple. Paul is referring to the Judaizers. He identified them in chapter 1. Those of the Jews' religion who are opposing his work among the Gentiles with vengeance. They're opposing it. He is saying that they're claiming to be the children of Abraham. These Judaizers that oppose me at every move I make, they claim to be the children of Abraham. But because they're trying to become heirs of Abraham through human effort, they are still in bondage. They're acting just like Hagar and Hagar's descendants. Keeping the law did not put them in bondage. They were already in bondage. Their mistake was in thinking that they could keep the law and be set free from the bondage of sin. Their mistake was in thinking that they could be justified by works. No man is justified in the sight of Yahweh by works. Salvation is by grace through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast. That is why Paul exclaims in verse 28 that we are Isaac, we are as Isaac, we are the children of promise. Our salvation is a result of a promise Yahweh made to Abraham. It involved a seed who would come and bear our sin. It involved a seed who would come and destroy death and sin. It involved our placing our faith and hope in Him and what He has done and what He will do. There is our hope. Salvation by grace through faith, not in keeping the law. We are the children, he said, of promise. We don't keep the law to be saved. Anybody in here trying to keep the law to get saved? You sure do get accused of it a lot. But we don't keep the law to get saved. We know better than that. No man is justified in the sight of Yahweh by keeping the law. But does that mean that we should not keep Torah? Let's really consider that question logically for just a moment. Does that mean we should not keep Torah? The bondage we were in was to sin. Sin had dominion. So it would be important for us to identify or define sin. What is sin? The Bible makes it clear. 1 John 3:4. Sin is the transgression of the law. We were in bondage to a power that drove us to transgress. Literally bondage. There was a power working in us that drove us to transgress anything Yahweh said. Yahweh delivered us from the penalty of that transgression and from the power that was driving us to transgress. That's what salvation by grace through faith is. See, if you don't understand Torah, you don't understand what salvation is. Salvation is delivering you from the penalty of transgressing Yahweh's law and from the power that was driving you to transgress the law. Now, does it make any sense to think that since we've been set free from the penalty of transgressing and the power that drove us to transgress, does it make any sense to now think that we can now transgress the law and it'd be okay? To say I don't have to keep the law is to say it's okay for me to transgress. It's okay for me to continue living the way I lived before I was born again, before I was delivered. Listen to what Paul said. Paul himself said. He said this in Romans 3:31. Do we then make void the law through faith? That's a great question. Do we then make void the law through faith? The word void there means to render it idle. Do we render the law idle through faith? What's the answer?
Absolutely not.
YAHWEH forbid, he said. And he went on to say, yea, we establish the law. The word establish means make it stand. We don't take the law and render it idle. Instead, we cause the law to stand through our faith. Listen to Paul in Romans 6:14. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law, but under grace. So what had dominion? Sin. What is sin? For transgressing the law shall not have dominion over you. Everybody wants to go to that next phrase, for you're not under the law, but under grace. And we're going to deal with that phrase, but not today. That phrase needs a whole session by itself. Maybe more than one. We'll deal with it later. But before you get to that second part of the sentence, pay attention to the first part. Sin shall not have dominion over you. Transgressing YAHWEH's law shall not have dominion over you. Why can't it now have dominion over you? Anybody know?
Christ is in you.
For you're not under law, but under grace. You don't just have the law telling you what you should do. You have the very power of YAHWEH working in you to enable you to obey Him. Paul said it this way to the Ephesians, the very same power that He used to resurrect Yeshua from the dead now abides and works in you. That's what grace is. Grace is the power of YAHWEH working in us. So sin can't have dominion over you anymore because there's a power working in you that sets you free from its enslaving power. What then? Romans 6:15. Shall we sin because we're not under the law but under grace? YAHWEH forbid. Shall we transgress the law? YAHWEH forbid. So this allegory Paul uses is simply meant to communicate to us that salvation cannot be obtained by human effort. The allegory does not in any way communicate that the law causes or brings people into bondage. There's nowhere in the Bible that teaches such a thing. Notice Paul's next point. His next point is that Ishmael, who was born of the flesh, persecuted Isaac, who was born of the Spirit. He said that pattern still holds true. The greatest enemy to the work that YAHWEH was doing through Paul was from the Jews' religion that he identifies in Galatians 1. They did not keep Torah. They instead kept Talmud, the oral law and the tradition of the elders, and they were the enemies who persecuted Paul and sought to kill him at every opportunity they could. They believed that a man was justified by works of the law. They believed that a man had to be circumcised to be saved, and they're militant about it. And because Paul taught you're justified by faith instead of by the works of the law, they literally stalked him, pursued him, arrested him, and sought to kill him. Paul's saying to the Galatians, this is no different than what we read about in the book of Genesis. Ishmael persecuted Isaac. He that's born of the flesh persecutes he that's born of the Spirit. It's the pattern we see through the Scriptures. And he's saying it's not me that you should be rejecting. He's saying, listen to Torah. Torah says, cast out the bondwoman and her child. So what he's saying is, what you in Galatia needs to do is cast out Jerusalem and her leadership. They're the ones that are in the wrong, not me. Jerusalem and her leadership are persecuting me, but I'm telling you the truth, that the only way to become a true heir of Abraham is by grace through faith. You cannot become one of his heirs by keeping the law like they're telling you. Cast out those who are teaching a salvation by works doctrine. And let me close with looking at one more passage. And then, as I said, we'll come back later and talk about what it means to be under the law and under grace. But go to Isaiah 54. And the reason I want you to go there is because Paul quotes the first verse of Isaiah 54 when he says, Rejoice, ye barren that bearest not. Break forth and cry, ye that travaileth not. For the desolate has many more children than she which has a husband. Paul quoted that in verse 27. Well, it's a direct quote coming out of Isaiah 54. I find it interesting that he went here when he's talking to the Gentiles about this subject of Hagar, Sarah, Ishmael, and Isaac. Salvation by work, salvation by grace. Let's read it now out of Isaiah 54, the first 3 verses for now. Sing, O barren, thou that didst not bear, break forth into singing, and cry aloud that you that did not travail with child, for more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married wife, says Yahweh. Enlarge the place of your tent, and let them, mark that word, let them stretch forth the curtains of thy habitations. Spare not, lengthen your cords, and strengthen your stakes. For you shall break forth on the right hand and on the left, and your seed shall inherit the Gentiles, and make the desolate cities to be inhabited. Yahweh speaking to Israel, who looks like they are absolutely nothing compared to the promise that he made to Abraham. Telling Abraham, you'll inherit the world. And here they are, because of their sins and transgressions, they've been beaten down to almost nothing. And Yahweh is prophesying through Isaiah and letting them know that they need to rejoice. Because an enlargement is coming. And where's the enlargement coming from? Verse 3, the Gentiles. And verse 2 says, let them stretch forth the curtains of your habitations. Drop down to verse 5. For your Maker is your husband. Yahweh of hosts is his name. And your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. The Elohim of the whole earth shall he be called. He's not just the Elohim of Israel. Whew. He's the Elohim of the whole earth. Verse 3 said that your seed shall inherit the Gentiles. This goes back to what Paul said in Galatians 4, that those who were under the law had to be redeemed so that they could receive the adoption of sons. All of these promises to Abraham and prophesied here in Isaiah 54 coming to pass in Paul's day. Now look in verse 13. And all your children shall be taught of Yahweh, and great shall be the peace of your children. All your children, Jews and Gentiles, shall be taught of Yahweh. What does Yahweh teach? He teaches what we call Torah. That's his instruction. So Paul is tying it all together to these Galatians in Galatians chapter 4 of saying, listen to me. The Judaizers are coming down here and they're acting like they care about you, but they don't care about you. They would exclude you. They don't care if you end up going to destruction or not, as long as it helps them. They don't care. That's what he said in the earlier verses of chapter 4. He said the Judaizers are coming down here telling you you got to be circumcised to be saved. He said, none of that is true. Your coming in to this family was prophesied long before. It was prophesied to Abraham. It was prophesied through Isaiah. And now it's coming to pass. You're saved by grace through faith. And you're adopted into this family. And every Sabbath, we're teaching you the oracles of Yahweh. Do not forsake that and be influenced by these Judaizers. Cast them out. For salvation is not by works. It's by faith. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. As His name is put upon you, so shall He Himself bless you.